So it's just as well that a young local, and I emphasise the word young. Well, no, even now I regard this fellow as a young fellow from Salthill, came along to actually explain it all to us, to illustrate it all for us, and to do it so well and so wonderfully and in such wonderful, simple language. It's a real pleasure to have and welcome home to Galway Harry McGee.
Well done.
You, Harry, would you please welcome Brian O'Connell from the Connacht Tribune. I got it wrong again. His name is actually Dave. I hand you over to the two boys.
I'm on a witness protection program, so cheers, Joe. Harry, thanks for bringing the summer of 1982 to Galway, that lovely, long, hot summer. I was going to wear my tweed suit tonight, but I was afraid I'd get mixed up for, I don't know, a Taoiseach or something. It's a brilliant book. As you know, I think it's absolutely fantastic. But I want to start at the end, if you don't mind. You met Malcolm Macarthur. I mean, people say you shouldn't meet your heroes. Meeting your anti-hero. What was that? Was that surreal?
It was, when first I met him, it was a little bit strange because I had an image in my mind of what Malcolm Macarthur might look at. And then when you meet him, he is that image, except he's maybe 30 years older now. He no longer wears a dicky bow, but he still dresses very raffishly. And people have mistaken him actually for Sean Fitzpatrick, the former disgraced banker with Anglo-Irish Bank. So I don't know what is worse to be in Irish society, a convicted murderer or a disgraced banker. But both of them look very, very alike. So the way I met him was, he's been out of prison since 2012. So he ended up spending 30 years in prison. And the strategy that they pursued during the actual court case, Paddy McEntee, who was Ireland's most famous lawyer at the time. So he pursued what looked like a very clever strategy. They first pursued a particular strategy in relation to a guilty but insane verdict, but that didn't work out. So they went for a kind of a fallback strategy where they tried to get him convicted for one murder and have a nolle prosequi, or a non-conviction, recorded for the second. And that succeeded. So what happened then was he was convicted only for one murder, and the thinking behind it from Paddy McEntee's perspective was that because he was only convicted for one, when it came that he was caught back to rights, so there's no way really that he was going to escape with a not guilty plea or a manslaughter plea. So the thinking was that if he was convicted for one murder rather than two, when it came to the release date and probation and all of that he would stand a better chance of an early release with one conviction rather than two. But the strategy was too clever by half, because what happened at the end was the case had already become notorious, and the non-conviction for the murder of Donald Dunn caused absolute outrage amongst people and created a huge hue and cry. And the Dunn family pursued a fruitless campaign for many years to get him convicted for that second murder. But it had an effect, because his case remained in the public mind for many years afterwards. So ultimately the decision on release would have been taken by the Minister for Justice of the day. And like all politicians, the first instinct that a minister will have when a decision comes up that might not be a crowd pleaser is to just check to see what the lie of the land is. And they knew that if they were to release him early, that it would rebound on them. So the net effect was that he spent a long time in prison, much longer than perhaps he would have if he had been convicted for two. So he was released in 2012. There were sightings of him. He lived in South Dublin, near Dunleera, for a while. So anyone who went walking along the Prom in Dunleera would see him regularly. And then he moved into the centre of the city. And you see him from time to time walking through the city. He goes to bookshops, he goes to libraries. Alan Shatter, the Minister for Justice who released him, he published a memoir several years ago, and Malcolm Macarthur turned up at the opening, and was interviewed there. So I think he likes his notoriety. I think this is what made him famous, for better or for good, and I think he has become used to it. I'm not saying comfortable with it, but he's become accustomed to it. So when you do meet him, he's very posh. He reminds me a little bit of a retired High Court judge, quite distant in the way that he talks to you, but he does talk quite a lot, but quite careful in what he says.
I know, and you make the point very forcefully in the book, that behind all of this and all of the caper and the farce, there are two families that suffered an unbelievable loss in the most brutal of circumstances. Will you tell us a little bit about Bridie Gargan and about Donald Dunn?
Yeah, so Malcolm MacArthur arrived into the summer of 1982 with a kind of a numbing realisation that the huge fortune that he had inherited as a young man was down to its last dregs, and essentially he was broke and on his uppers. So he and his partner and their young child had moved over to Tenerife to live because it was cheaper. I think his partner was aware that money was tight, but she didn't know how precarious his finances were. So he became obsessed with money and with recovering money. But he'd never worked in his life, and he'd kind of lived his life in a gilded cage. He had a governess when he was small. He was meant to go to a private school in England. He'd gone to university in California. He'd always, lived off the largesse of his parents who had means, and he had inherited a huge amount of money from his father, which he had frittered away. So he had no life skills. He hadn't worked. He was a strange person. He was an oddball. He was kind of slightly aloof, distant. Some people described him as arrogant. Some people described him as a fantasist. So there was a kind of a slight detachment there when it came to his interactions with other human beings. So over in Tenerife, he obsessed about, recovering his fortune. And the way that he read about IRA heists, post offices and bank robberies, which were common enough in Ireland at the time, and he said, I'm going to do that. So overnight he kind of recreated himself as a would-be armed robber. But he had no idea as to how to do that. And he was kind of...
when you say that he had no idea how to do that, that would be like me saying I'm a would-be astronaut, because he actually hadn't a clue. First of all, he hadn't a gun, which was central to this story, but he hadn't a clue where he was going with any of this. And as you say, he did live his life as a fantasist. People thought he was a lecturer in Cambridge University. It would strike me actually that in the Google era he wouldn't last 10 minutes, because a simple search would show you that this guy is making it up as he's going along. But robbing a bank was I would like to think it should be as far away from him as it would be for me and you to decide to rob a bank.
Yeah, he had no idea as to how to go about it, but he did concoct a plan, and his plan was absolutely bonkers. It was crazy. So he said in order to rob a bank, he needed to get a car, and in order to rob a bank, he needed to get a gun. So he came back to Ireland with the mission of getting a car and getting a gun. And at the time, anybody with a bit of nous would have known that if you went down to Sheriff Street or Sean McDermott Street and offered somebody a fiver down there, they could get you a car in 5 minutes. At the time...
possibly a gun.
And a gun, yeah. You'd have to do a little bit more digging to get a gun, but if you were determined to get one, you'd get one very easily. At the time, the IRA paramilitaries would regularly steal cars, and the Ford Cortina was a particular target because there was a skeleton key that could open, there was a special skeleton key that could open every Ford Cortina in the land. So it was quite an easy thing to steal a car. So he decided to steal a car. He was going to steal a car, and if he had to kill somebody along the way to steal a car, he would do so. So that shows you how detached from any kind of rational thinking he was. So he came back to Ireland. He created this kind of, to me it was like a disguise from Inspector Clouseau, this ridiculous disguise of a heavy military combat jumper, the kind that action men used to wear with the patches on the shoulder and the thing, a tweed hat. He grew a beard. He got spectacles which were, as thick as glass bottles, so he couldn't look through the spectacles. And he was kind of strange. He kind of loped around the place with his hand dug in his pocket. So he was instead of making himself kind of inconspicuous, he made himself really conspicuous. And he was noticed everywhere he went. So after 2 weeks first of all, he tried to get a gun. He went to a couple of clay pigeon shoots around Dublin and loped around, acted strange. Everybody was suspicious of him. He didn't succeed in getting the gun. And he was kind of an introvert, so he wouldn't talk to people, so he would find it very hard to engage with people. So in the end, he said, I'll have to go and get a car. So he went to the Phoenix Park looking for what he described as easy prey. And unfortunately, it just so happened that on the day he went, there was a young nurse from the St. James's Hospital, Bridie Gargan, who was an award-winning nurse. She was studying midwifery at the time. She had just put in a very long shift in the hospital. At 5 o'clock, she finished her shift. Her flat was in Castleknock on the far side of the park from St. James's Hospital. So she drove through the park to the midway point, where there's a big roundabout in the middle of the park for anybody who knows Phoenix Park, with the monument of a phoenix, or an eagle monument as they call it there, just beside Oras Nuachtaráin. And then on the other side there's Deer Park, which is like Oras Nuachtaráin. It's another Gamlin designed building, kind of a white building, sumptuous with a very large estate. And she parked close to there near the back of it. She went into long grass and she went sunbathing, getting the last light. It was daylight today, it was a beautiful day, and she went sunbathing. So he arrived in the park with an imitation shotgun, with a lump hammer, with a shovel, and essentially the shovel was to bury victims if he came across them. But how he managed to bury a victim in the Phoenix Park in the middle of summer with thousands of people there is beyond me. But it did show you how kind of dissociated he was.
In a three-piece suit and an army.
Yeah, nobody knew. Stealing a car, he could have driven it away and nobody would have been any the wiser. But for some reason he ordered her into the car. And naturally enough, once she was in the back of the car, she began to panic a little bit. And it's that stage that he attacked her, and he attacked her in the most brutal fashion. And it just so happened that one of the gardeners working in the American residence grounds, Paddy Byrne, who I met and interviewed for the podcast last year and for the book, he's a great man, came over and knew there was something was going wrong. He'd seen Malcolm Macarthur jumping from tree to tree. He was like a pantomime villain from a Don Busico play. You know, the way that they kind of, the big steps sloping in, and then he'd be running from tree to tree. So he knew that there was something strange happening. So when he saw the attack in the car, he ran over. And he was a very brave man. He tried to grab the gun of Malcolm Macarthur, but it was such a hot day, and he was so panicky and he was so sweaty that it slipped from his palms. So he backed away eventually, and then Malcolm Macarthur drove away, and by a series of kind of Keystone Cop episodes managed to escape into the ether. So that was Bridie Gargan, and that was shocking because, I mean, it was, she was a stranger to him.
This is what I think you capture very well in the book, because on one hand, yes, it is hilariously funny that there is a guy going around so inappropriately dressed, so obvious when he's trying to make himself not obvious, in this sweltering summer in Dublin, with a plan that is just so off the rails. It is hilarious. And yet the cold-blooded, brutal way that he takes a life that he didn't have to take, not that you ever have to take a life, but you know what I'm saying, is that he could have just gone away with the car. And it is that balance between not turning this story into a farce and almost having this anti-hero, but seeing him for a cold-blooded killer, no matter how he tries to analyse it himself, that's what he is.
It was brutal, and it's for, I've interviewed IRA people who killed others, and they talked about this period of this, how they psyched themselves up to do it, and this process of desensitizing themselves. But what he did was kind of beyond that. For them, the people he killed weren't even human beings. So there was and he expressed no mercy or no remorse afterwards. So I mean, there's certainly some sociopathic tendencies, and they might have been dormant, might never have existed until then, but they certainly emerged during that period, especially because within 2 days of that attack, he was on the hunt for a gun, and he was quite prepared to do exactly the same as he had done. So it was, it's baffling. I mean, the big question about Malcolm Macarthur that has been asked ever since, and he's never spoken about it to any great extent, was, why did he do what he did? And to answer that question is a very complex one, and I think it's something that somebody like me with no qualifications in that area wouldn't even deign to do, because ultimately I think there might not be any answer that's kind of comprehensive or fully satisfactory. You're examining actions that are, right at the periphery of our experience as human beings.
But I think you do it like a good journalist does, in that you deal with it in facts and in carrying his statement in full, and that detachment that he has from his own actions. I mean, I thankfully couldn't put myself into the head of a murderer, but I would have thought if something went as badly off the rails as the killing of Bridie Gargan, that the last thing I'd be doing is looking up the small lads for a gun and heading down to Edenderry and sleeping on a bench overnight before finding Donald Dunn and killing him as well.
Yep, and doing it in the same brutal, random, summary manner as he did with. Can you hear? You can hear, okay? You can. Yeah. That he did with Bridie Gargan, and with Donald Dunn. I mean. Well, what happened with Donald Dunn is he went down on the Saturday night. By the time he arrived at Donald Dunn's house, it was too late. And in a statement he said he got cold feet. So he spent the night sitting at a place called the Harbour. So Edenderry is a town that's right on the border between Offaly. It's in County Offaly, but it's right on the border with Kildare. And there's a spur from the Grand Canal. The Grand Canal is maybe about 1.5 kilometres south of the town. But there's a spur from the Grand Canal, beautiful, because I walked it when I was researching it, that runs all the way into the town, and it finishes off with a place called the Harbour, where the barges are berthed. It's a little bit like a Lido, and it's a very pleasant spot. So we ended up spending the night there, sitting on the bench. And Edenderry was a small town in the 1980s. I kind of likened it a little bit to Hall's Victorian Weekly. At the very opening sequence of Hall's Victorian Weekly always showed a provincial town, a tractor passing, people coming out of the bank, walking along. It was a very small provincial town where everybody knew everybody else. And of course, he was clean shaven at this stage because he shaved off his beard, but he looked so odd that he attracted attention. So everybody in the town saw him either on the Saturday or on the Sunday, because he arrived up at the square on Sunday morning. He demonstrated it by taking a couple of shots at a white post, and he handed the gun to Malcolm Macarthur, and Malcolm Macarthur turned around and just shot him there and then. It was like just shocking. And then the body was left. He left the body, took the car, went into Dublin, and later in that day, by chance, a family from Dublin had been down visiting the area. They'd gone to the canal, and then they came along the bog, and they decided they'd stop for a picnic. And it was their 7-year-old son who went kind of on a wander, who discovered the body half hidden in the kind of the scrub and bushes there. So that was deeply shocking as well.
And at the other end, when he arrives in Dublin in an Offaly Reg car, a group of lads looking for Croke Park think they found a fellow who's going to lead them all the way.
Yeah, you could. The plotline almost follows the course of the GAA that summer. The Leinster final was on that Sunday, and Offaly were playing against Kilkenny. And so he left Rathangan. He drove into Rathangan. He went back by a different route to Dublin, and then went in along the Naas Road, and then eventually wound up going up towards Maynooth and in by Island Bridge. But there were people from Offaly who, as he neared Dublin, they saw Donald Dunn's car in front of them. It was an escort with the Offaly registration. And they decided that this is an Offaly supporter going to Croke Park. So they followed him all the way into town, and he only went as far as Dame Street, and he parked outside the Central Bank and abandoned the car there. And they realised that it wasn't him, so they made their own way to Croke Park. But they gave very good evidence to the Gardaí in subsequent days as to it gave the Gardaí a very good idea of where he'd left the car, and they also gave a very good description of what he was carrying, and this blue hold-all bag that he carried everywhere with him, and also what he looked like. And actually there was a Garda description that was issued after, which I've included in the book, that was issued some days after the Edenderry murder, at a point where they had linked both murders, fingerprint evidence from both, they were able to link it very quickly, and knew that the same perpetrator had done both murders. But the description was like extraordinary. I mean, it was such an uncanny, accurate description of him. You know, just the way he looked, the way he presented himself, the way he walked around. He used to have these jackets with kind of square pockets, and he'd have his hands kind of stuffed into the...
Before we get on to some of the other characters in a minute in this, but even before that, I mean, at such brutal double murders linked, in a time before what we might call CSI type, you know, computerization, the legwork that they did and the quality of the detection work that they did, am I wrong in thinking that was admirable?
It was. I mean, the man who led the investigation was John Courtney, who was a very controversial character because there were people that worked with him who were known as the Heavy Gang, who essentially, you know, I mean, were accused, and more than accused, kind of, you know, using heavy-handed tactics to get to, especially in paramilitary cases, to extract admissions from suspects. But there was none of that in this case. This was probably John Courtney's best case as a detective, and it showed some of the methods that he used were extraordinary. He demanded, I think there were more than 50 detectives. We actually have one of them here in the audience tonight. I don't know if he wants to identify himself, but he's sitting down there in front of us.
Identify.
Peter, yeah. There were over 50 detectives working on the case, and John Courtney's method was that in the particular area where the crime was committed or where the perpetrator was spotted, they would swamp the area with guards, and they'd go to every household, to every person, and they'd take statements from everybody. And John Courtney demanded that no question, no stone be left unturned in any statement, and he was a very hard man to work for. So if he was reading, and then he'd be in at 6 o'clock in the morning with his head over a desk, going through the statements, looking for anything that might suggest a lead, or looking for anything that might suggest an inconsistency. And he was apparently brilliant at that. And if a detective went out and didn't ask all the questions, or the right questions, they would be harangued in front of all of the other detectives in the incident room in Kevin Street. He was very, very demanding, but very thorough in that way. And I think he was lucky that there were other detectives, Tony Hickey, who was a detective sergeant, and Noel Conroy, who was from Mayo Man, who was an inspector at the time. Both of them became commissioner, Tony Hickey, assistant commissioner, Noel Conroy, commissioner, were both amazing detectives as well, and driven in the same way. So they spent a lot of time in the north of Dublin, because that's where Malcolm Macarthur escaped to at the start. But they swamped Glasnevin and Ballymun, Ballyheary, Ashburn, County Meath, all of the places residing with, they got thousands of statements. And they were able to use the statements to kind of, it's almost like whiskey being distilled, you know, that you start off with a lot and then they just get down to the essence. And they were able to narrow it down. And the thing about Malcolm Macarthur is he was completely outside the realm of the usual suspect, because, you know, he was known by very few people in Ireland. He hung around in very elevated circles. He'd been abroad for a period. So it was almost like he'd dropped out of Mara. So, you know, even though they had a very good description of the man, he didn't, you know, he wasn't on any database, or he wasn't, you know, known as other people might be known in Ireland. So that was the method that they used, and there were, I mean, Hickey in particular was a very prestigious detective, and, you know, they by a process, they realised that the suspect was in South Dublin rather than North Dublin, and then events happened very quickly, you know, that confirmed that, and then Malcolm Macarthur kind of ended up kind of incriminating himself.
The time that he tried to rob the American, will you explain a bit, because as you say, some of this, he was in Dunleary when the search was on the north side, he was moving around as, and it didn't seem as though he was doing this in any very clever way. He just was lucky for a little while, but it was always going to go against him because of the shoe leather that was worn out and the real old good style Garda investigation. So what happened? What was that break?
Yeah, I mean, he was completely incompetent, and he was completely bonkers as well. I mean, the stuff he was doing wasn't rational, but it was, you know, he was killing people. So it made him very dangerous, and he had no criminal cleverness or nous. But the reason that he escaped detention for so long was because he came from completely outside the sphere of anything you would imagine as a criminal. So the reason they originally focused on the north side was when he escaped after his attack on Bridie Garden. He went into a travel agency, and he asked the woman to order. He ordered her. You know, she thought he had a kind of an order of the manners, but he ordered the woman in the agency to order him a taxi to Dunleera, to Blackrock, and she told him, why take a taxi? There were buses going outside. And before she could converse with him further, he ran out and jumped onto a bus. But unfortunately for him, the bus went north, so he ended up in Ballymun, Finglas, and in a pub in Finglas, and he had a beard, and he hacked off the beard without any shaving cream, and all the locals noticed him there, but they never.
There'd be something of an omerta in a pub in Finglas that wouldn't necessarily have them ringing 999.
Well, they saw this guy with blood all over his shirt, who was shaving himself in the jacks without any shaving cream and hacking his beard out with blood everywhere, and they made nothing of it. And it was only when the cops arrived at the door a couple of weeks later that people kind of said, "Oh yeah, there was a guy in here." So a strange thing happened in the Fingal House Inn, and but that turned out to be a bit of a red herring, because that focused, and he'd been seen in Ballyheiry, which is north of there near the airport, trying to get a gun at a clay pigeon shooting. So they suspected initially that he was there, but then as they got more information, they learned that he'd taken a taxi down to Dunleera. And he said, "I don't have £1,000. And Malcolm Macarthur said, "Well, write me a cheque." And which is a very strange thing for a would-be bank robber to say, but it did show his complete his complete misunderstanding of what a bank robber or what a stick-up merchant should do. So in the end, Harry Beeling had some training. He was an former American diplomat, and he might have been associated with the CIA as well, but he had some training. So he realised that if he didn't escape, this guy was going to kill him, and he was probably right, because Malcolm Macarthur had killed everybody he had encountered until then for less. So he picked his opportunity and scarpered and made good his escape, and probably escaped with his life. So that left Malcolm Macarthur on the house. He left the house. He stopped a driver and got a lift down as far as Dalkey. And then he ended up at the door of Patrick Connolly, his good friend for many, many years. So that's when the story kind of hinged a little bit and pivoted a little bit and entered another dimension. Yeah,
I'd be kind to everybody here. Most of us may remember this actual event in real time, but for the few that don't, Paddy Connolly was his involvement with Charles J. Haughey goes back to the arms trial, appropriately enough. And then he becomes the Attorney General under Haughey's first government, second government.
Second government, yeah. Haughey became Taoiseach in late '79. That was his first government. He succeeded Jack Lynch, and then he lost the election in 1981, and then won the election in February '82. But it was a very precarious government. It was a minority government, relying on the support of Tony Gregory, an independent, plus two TDs from the Workers' Party, which was a small, fringe, left-wing party at the time. Paddy Connolly was a friend of his. He had represented him at the arms trial, as you said, but Haughey knew him going back to the 40s and the 50s, when both of them had done the King's Inns together, and Connolly had always been a big supporter of his, and had been a good friend of his, and remained a good friend of his. So he became Attorney General, and was, he was getting into the job. He had a very busy couple of months, and was preparing for his holidays. So Malcolm Macarthur arrived at his door. The reason he knew Malcolm Macarthur was that he was very friendly with Malcolm Macarthur's partner, wife, Brenda Little, and had met her in Dublin and become friends with her. She had subsequently met Malcolm Macarthur. They married, or they didn't marry, but they had a child together, and the couple were very friendly with Connolly, and they used to socialise together, and had in fact stayed at his apartment and lived in his old apartment for several months after he had vacated it. So he was delighted to welcome Malcolm Macarthur, and he ended up staying there for a fortnight. And Paddy Connolly was completely oblivious to the fact that this guy was the subject of the biggest manhunt in Irish.
Which was extraordinary as Attorney General as well. I mean, he brought him to Croke Park in a state car.
He did. The All-Ireland semi-final between Galway and Kilkenny. Actually, Maureen Gagan Quinn was at that. She was Junior Minister for Justice at the time. And but there was a kind of a myth that went around that Malcolm Macarthur was brought to the VIP section and that he was present while Paddy Connolly and the Gordy Commissioner had a conversation about the man. That sounds like a very compelling story, but actually, unfortunately, it's not true. Malcolm Macarthur did go to the game. He went to the Hogan stand. He bought a ticket, went through the turnstiles with Paddy Connolly's nephew, Stephen Connolly, who I interviewed for the book. And Stephen Connolly said that he had no interest in hurling. He spent the whole game wearing dark glasses and looking around. And Stephen was a perceptive young man, noticed that there were grass stains on his trousers and stains on his shirt, and that Malcolm Macarthur was behaving very oddly, very kind of ill at ease, looking around all the time, and guessed that something was wrong. But it was only afterwards that he realised, exactly what was wrong. An irony there and a paradox there that, this Gubu became a kind of an albatross around his neck, and every time that Haughey would make a cock-up or make a mistake afterwards, immediately the Gubu slur would emerge in headlines or from the mouths of his opponents. And for once, he did very little wrong. Now, he did make a couple of mistakes, but they were mistakes of the moment. There was no motive or no agenda behind them in this particular incident. So when Malcolm Macarthur was finally arrested by the Gardaí in Paddy Connolly's flat, Paddy Connolly had to ring Charlie Haughey to tell him, that Macarthur had been arrested in his flat. Charlie Haughey was on Inishvikalon in his holiday boat hole, and he just arrived the previous day. And
the Dáil had just risen, isn't that? After a tumultuous 6 months.
Yeah, it was a ramshackle government, and it had just barely made it to the summer, and was hanging on by a thread. But they'd made it to the summer, and now they're saying that maybe if we come back in the autumn, maybe things will look up. There was a miscommunication. I think on Haughey's part there might have been some drink taken on his part, and he might not have been in the receiving communication kind of mood at the time. And I think Paddy Connolly might have been he had planned this very elaborate holiday to the US, and he was going to fly from Ireland to London and then from London to New York by Concorde. And a Concorde flight back in 1982, cost 6 months' wages for the ordinary industrial wage. It was huge for this next day. Haughey wasn't aware that Macarthur was caught in Connolly's flat. So whatever miscommunication there was, he just thought that Connolly was ringing him out of courtesy to say that this perpetrator, or the suspected perpetrator, has been caught. So it was only the following day that Haughey was fully briefed, and that he realised the gravity of the situation and how serious it was. So then he tried frantically to reach Paddy Connolly. He reached him in London, and Paddy Connolly wouldn't come home, and they had a conversation that was described as fraught. Paddy Connolly was very determined to go on his holidays. But by the time that Paddy Connolly arrived in New York, he was hounded by the media over there. And the American, as Frank Dunlop told me, he said the American media made the Irish media look like reporters for the Sacred Heart Messenger. They were vicious and they were brutal. So he realised at that stage that he would have to come home. So he got another Concorde flight back to London. When he arrived in London, the BBC 9 o'clock news carried, it had become an international scandal at this stage. And people thought that he was fleeing Ireland. He was a fugitive from justice, and the conspiracy theories had already started, and some of them are still circulating 40 years afterwards. Press conferences, the 4 famous adjectives: grotesque, unprecedented, bizarre, unbelievable, that became the basis for the Gubu acronym. So instead of clearing the air, he kind of compounded his own difficulties. But just going back to the point that you originally made, Dave, none of that was of his own doing. He made a couple of mistakes, but there was no agenda behind it. He said grotesque mischance, and it was Gubu. But the problem was he was caught right in the middle of it.
And I mean, as a political anorak, I love some of the stuff about Haughey, always do. And I mentioned when we were talking earlier, the line that you took from John Randolph.
Yeah.
And it sits so beautifully, like a rotting mackerel by moonlight, he shone and he stank. I just wanted to say that out loud.
That always summed up Haughey for me, you know, and the prelude to that is so brilliant, so corrupt. All of the public service, you know, in the end, his legacy was very, very mixed indeed. There was brilliance, but it was, you know, sullied by this.
You make that point as to, you know, I mean, I think particularly as a minister, he was a very impressive minister. I think anyone who's on the free travel and there's nobody here, but that's down to one of Haughey's legacies.
Yeah, and the way he promoted the arts, the IFSC, Temple Bar. You know, he liked the grand vision. He was always looking for an idea that would make, you know, and he was good at that.
Two murders, they were intrinsically linked from the very start on this. And I understand it's about getting a conviction, and I understand life is life, and that's how it transpired, and he probably wouldn't have done any more than the 30 years, even if he was convicted for both. But I'll put it another way, you do understand the frustration, and more than that, of the Dunn family.
Oh, it was complete injustice to the Dunn family. So the first defence that was pursued by Charlie Haughey was one called automatism. So essentially, it was nowadays it's not guilty by reason of insanity, but then it was guilty but insane, and it was a form of insanity that, from a legal point of view, you know, could get a person a verdict of guilty but insane. So essentially, the guards had never heard of automatism before. So essentially, what automatism described is somebody who is in a temporary fugue state, essentially going around like a zombie. And it happens to people who have diabetes, who go into kind of a diet he was doing. He was not aware that what he was doing was wrong, and was criminally or had a criminal intent. And the defence almost worked. The two psychiatrists who were employed by the state to examine Macarthur came to a kind of a similar view that he'd been going through this very strange, and he was going through some very strange period, but was it a stage where he wasn't aware of his actions? That was the question. So that almost succeeded, but it was only in the week before the case went to trial, and Gardaí at senior level were getting very worried, you know, that this defence might actually work, even though it would have to be put to a jury ultimately. But they reminded the prosecuting counsel of the letter that had been found in Malcolm Macarthur's possessions, and the letter had been written during his time in Ireland. It wasn't a letter, sorry, it was a note, and the note essentially was a very detailed plot to kill his own mother, including the method, what he would do when he'd find the body, including funeral arrangements. But the jury would have no sympathy for him, because the juries tend to ignore all the legal niceties, and I'm not saying that they decide on instinct, but they do decide on hunch and on emotion and on venal, you know, the decisions can be slightly more venal than intellectual for juries. So if Malcolm Macarthur was put in front of a jury, McEntee knew that he would elicit zero sympathy, you know, that no matter what was said in his defence, that he would go down.
So this was damage limitation?
It was, and it was accepted by, and for whatever reason it was accepted by the DPP. And the DPP then and now has a policy of not making any public pronouncements, which I think is kind of wrong, because they do it in England, and they do it in Scotland, and they do it in other places. They explain if they're not taking a prosecution, or if they're taking a particular course of action, they'll explain the reasons why. But for some reason that's never been the case in Ireland. And the fact that the DPP wouldn't say that just added to the injury and compounded the grief that was felt by the Dunn family. And it led to huge bitterness on their part for many, many years afterwards. I was actually talking to a politician during the week who went canvassing, a Fine Gael politician who went canvassing to their farm outside Derry, and he got chased from the door many years afterwards. You know, they were still very bitter about it many, many years afterwards.
Well, you can absolutely understand that. I should have said that if anybody in the audience would like to ask a question, I'm aware in terms of time, but if somebody does want to say anything or ask Harry a question rather than me doing that, they're most welcome to do so. in terms of your involvement in this, it began with the Sunday Press right at the beginning, but then more recently in terms of the podcast, and then the book. There was almost a natural flow to all of this. Were you surprised at how little has been written about this over the last 40 years?
I was very surprised that nothing substantial had been done on it. So, I mean, it was written about extensively, of course, at the time. And every anniversary, 10th anniversary, 20th anniversary, there'd be a big piece in the newspapers. But most of them kind of retreaded the known facts and the kind of the more famous facts. So I moved to Dublin in '92, and the very first piece, the major piece I wrote for the Sunday Press, was a piece on to coincide with the 10th anniversary of Google. So I interviewed Paddy Connolly, Courtney, some of the barristers, Christy Dunn, and a lot of, that was when my interest. I'd known about it because I'd read about it when I was in school, but that was the first time my interest was piqued in it. So I kind of followed it over the years without really writing about it again. So at the start of last year, I knew the 40th anniversary was coming up, and I thought that if people were still around, it would make the basis of a very good podcast. But I wasn't sure if the people, how many people were still. I mean, Paddy Connolly had passed away, John Courtney was dead, Haughey, of course, is dead, and other people who were involved had died. So I wasn't sure how many people were left, and many people would be willing to speak to me. And I also wanted to approach Malcolm Macarthur himself to see if he'd speak to me or not. So I had to try and track all those people down. So I did, and some of them were harder to track down than others. But once we got people talking, we knew there was the basis of this podcast there. And then when I started researching it, there were so many aspects of the case that were just extraordinary that had been kind of forgotten about over the years. So we captured some of them in the podcast. But I knew that once the podcast was over, that there was definitely the basis of a book in it, and the book would allow would allow the story to breathe a little bit more, would allow me to write more about the background, to write more about the context, and more about some of the other incidents that kind of happened before and afterwards. And as I researched it, all of these details and events and occurrences and observations that had long fallen into obscurity kind of emerged again. And, the story is just, it was such a compelling story. Now, there were a few, Peter Murta, the Irish Times journalist, and Joe Joyce wrote a book called The Boss, which was published in 1983, which had a very good chapter about Google in it, especially an amazing account of the Harry Beeling incident, which was a really strange incident, but they had a brilliant portrayal of that. And then there was a guy called Stephen Ray, who wrote a book about Irish murders with a chapter in it as well, with some interesting detail. But besides that, there was very little. So I was surprised because it's, the story is just, it's Google. I mean, Haughey was nailed for saying Google, but it was Google, absolutely.
But if it wasn't true, you couldn't make this up, or there would be fellas with white coats coming to collect you. If you came up with this as a bound for a work of fiction.
Yeah. Well, I was saying during the week that it's like a Harlan Coben Netflix movie, except all of those unreal events are actually real. And at the time, I'd say people who were living through it were saying, this just can't be true. I mean, Tony Hickey said that when they first made the connection between Malcolm Macarthur and the Attorney General, I mean, he was scared to say it, because if they were wrong, the consequences would have been untold, but they suddenly, the coincidences and the connections and the nexus, they were just mad. They were just completely and utterly mad. And I'm not saying the book wrote itself, but the story itself was such a compelling story. I can't remember any story that comes anywhere close to it in terms of its extraordinary detail.
But, and as I say, it's not to blow smoke at you, but the thing is, it could be just a farce. But it's not. It's a very serious, in-depth story, and as I said, acknowledging the hurt, the awful hurt to two families. But it was fundamental to our lives as a nation at that time. Have Netflix rang you yet? Is there? I mean, surely there is a movie. I'm not suggesting that you may make it, although you'd be wise to give it a go. But there is a movie in this.
Yeah, I'd say there'd be more because of the detail. I think probably more of a series. Yeah. Well, there is. I mean, there's a small Irish company who did on Colleen Kuhn, and they're interested in it, so I'm kind of writing a treatment for them. Now, treatments are written, 10 a penny, twice, 3 times a week, so something might come of it and nothing might come of it, but they're definitely, at this moment in time, it looks like there could be the basis of something in it sometime in the future.
Well, that sounds like that'll put the tin hat on the whole thing for us. Again, just before we finish up, if anybody would like to ask a question.
Harry, can I? Sorry,
Yeah. Hi, Christy.
Just
Yeah.
Yeah, shout out there, Christy.
no, in relation to the Attorney General, Harry, I could never understand. I have the advantage of having read the book now, and that there was a description of MacArthur, and here was the Attorney General bringing him into Merrion Square several mornings,
Yeah.
and yet his description was out there. The public were aware of it. Was he oblivious or totally naive to what was going on? It's baffling in that sense that here he was conveying this man whose description was very much in the public domain, that he couldn't square the circle. You know what I mean? It was
Yeah, but he just, the Malcolm Macarthur that he knew, he thought he was the most gentle, scholarly man. And I think that not in a million years.
It showed a lack of judgment then as well when he heads off to.
But that was definitely a lack of judgment by going the next day, a naivety,
so
and he paid the consequence for that. But I just think that there was a very good description of him, but was the description, Fintan O'Toole in his book wrote about growing up. Was 24 in 1982 and living in Blackrock, and he went in to buy a newspaper one day, and the shopkeeper looked at him very suspiciously. And Fintan O'Toole at the time had curly dark hair, he had a beard, he probably looked kind of wan, So he actually believed, that somebody was the guards were going to pick him up because he looked, and then he had to debate with himself whether he should contact the guards. And then he said, if I contact the guards, maybe they think that's what a psychopath would do. I got myself into all kinds of trouble. So, I don't think in a million years that Paddy Connolly would have made the connection between this mad guy, no matter how they described him, and his gentle kind of academic guest. They seem to be kind of polar opposites. Yeah.
We'd have a very different Ireland if Fintan was done for 2 murders. This man here.
My question is a bit similar. Presumably MacArthur still had all these bloody clothes and heavily shaved beard, and he had grass on his shoes when he was at Connolly's house, and Connolly didn't speculate for himself even as to what was going on.
Actually, when I interviewed Connolly back in the 1990s, he said that he wasn't a very perceptive person. He himself was kind of a bookish kind of guy, and he said perhaps if he'd looked he would have noticed that MacArthur's shoes were scuffed and that his clothes looked kind of threadbare. But he said they weren't the kind of things that he'd notice as a human being, whereas his nephew, Stephen, who had stayed with him, noticed all of those things and commented on them to the dad. But to notice those things and then to kind of immediately associate them with this kind of notorious killer who was on the loose, to me would just seem like a stretch, to me anyway.
That's about as good a defence as Paddy Connolly is going to get. Naive is probably one word for it. Harry, I've said it to you before, I think it's an absolute marvellous read. I've also had the privilege of reading in advance. It is a phenomenal work, and you're to be congratulated on it. I think, as I said in conversation, I tend to think 1982 was yesterday. 1982 is as far from now as the Second World War was from 1982.
Yeah.
So it is, I'm afraid, ancient history. And congratulations to the men who did the job. It wasn't them that decided that it would be 1 and not 2.
And Christy was a guard as well. I don't think you worked on that investigation, but you would have known all of the...
some of the individuals, some of the members,
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. I just want to say thank you to Dave O'Connell as well. I succeeded Dave when my first job in journalism was with Connacht Tribune, and I got the job that Dave O'Connell left on his way down to Cork, to the Cork Examiner.
I thought you were on my way down.
You're never going down, Dave. You're always well done. So thanks very much indeed. And also thanks so much to Tom Kenny, great lifelong friend who has been gracious enough to host us here this evening. And thank you very much to Tom and to Sarah and to all the Kenny family for being so good to us. Thank you very much.
To both for a wonderful evening, a wonderfully entertaining, which reflects the book, which is equally entertaining. I mean, it's factually terrible what has happened in it, but it's wonderful. And this is just one of a number of events that we've planned here for the near future. I'm going to give you a brief plug. So some of the literary events we have coming up are Richard Ford, Anne Enright, Emer MacLeod.